Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Makbul with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be taking a look at two very important stories. The first, of course, is in reference to something which unfortunately once again is a cause of much concern and worry in Pakistan with regards to, of course, the issue of terrorism that seems to have spiked up again. Of course, this was a major concern in the country, especially since the takeover of the Afghan Taliban in Afghanistan and after the US troop withdrawal. And then, of course, we saw that there was an emerging threat coming in from the TTP as well, especially in areas of KP. And now, of course, we've also seen that on Friday there was an attempt of a terrorist attack in which we lost the lives of a policeman and a taxi driver who fortunately, of course, saved us all from the kind of damage that could have occurred. And this was, of course, in the capital, bringing in a lot of concerns from the embassies, including that of Saudi Arabia, Australia and the US, who have been issuing their own advisories to the citizens of concerning, of course, travel within the capital and to also, of course, the citizens who are planning to come in to Pakistan for any travel purposes. This, of course, brings us to major concerns as to where we stand today in terms of the kind of terrorist threat that is there, and then also in terms of the kind of security measures that needed to be taken. The attack that happened on Friday is something that is being talked about as in coming from a gap of about 8 years, with the last one being back in 2014. And of course, Pakistan has witnessed its fair share of terrorist attacks, and we, of course, had overcome this particular issue about a lot of sacrifices later, and then, of course, a lot of measures from our security forces as well. But in terms of where we stand today, we also see that there is, of course, renewed measures being put in, especially in the federal capital, with a new plan for security personnel and the police. And then, of course, we also, of course, have seen an importance towards this issue coming in from the Prime Minister and other major important aspects as well. But exactly what that means in terms of the kind of strategy and action plan that we're going to be going ahead with is still, of course, something that we need to perhaps look further into. And then in terms of where we stand, not just with regards to the federal capital, but in the rest of the country, it's going to be important to consider what our measures are going to be, and in the future how we're going to be able to perhaps deal with this issue and help with preventing its resurgence. We're also in our second segment going to be taking a look at what is going on in Gawader. There is, of course, a Haq Do Tehreek that has been going on for quite some time, which is led by Mr. Rahman, who has previously also been leading such movements. There are concerns with regards to the objectives of this particular movement. However, of course, the kind of issues that are being put forward are also valid and genuine, and they have been met. The kind of demands that have been put forward in the associations and correspondence that have been going on for quite some time, we've seen that those demands have been met. But unfortunately, the leadership of this movement is not still putting out any sort of incentive in terms of making the decision to go forward and stalling the process, which is, of course, putting question marks at the political motivations behind this movement as well, at the cost of course, the very serious and genuine concerns of the population. What this means for the people of Balochistan, what this means for the political dynamics of that province, and what it means for CPAC are, of course, larger concerns. And how do we, of course, deal with the issue of political gains at the cost of protesters who are talking about very valid concerns? So that's going to be our discussion at the end of the show today. For this and more, as always, in the studios, I've been joined by senior analyst Farooq Battafi, and we've also been joined in the studio today by security analyst Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali. Thank you very much for joining us in the show today. We've also been joined by former IG Police Dr. Syed Kadeem Imam, who's joined us online. Thank you very much for being a part of the debate. But let me start with you, Mr. Ali. Considering, of course, the kind of issues that we're now facing, it seems that unfortunately we're back many years ago, where we were dealing with these issues and threats. And now that, of course, we've seen it really hit the center as well, we've seen a kind of enhanced activity towards dealing with this issue. But it's not that that it's just two-day event that has happened or just something that has just come around the corner. This has been going on for at least quite some time, at least since the US troop withdrawal. And we have seen that the issue of the threat of terrorism has been increasing at least since then. And so it seems that perhaps when we look at the way our strategies have been in the past and where we stand today, perhaps there may be a more preemptive approach to the issue of terrorism as well. And I'd like you to also shed light on that. And then, of course, considering the issues that we're facing right now and the kind of concerns that we have, how do we go ahead with? Is this something that because we've dealt it in the past, we can do so again?
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's a very important topic and becoming increasingly important. I think terrorism right now, the situation I believe is far more precarious than it was in the earlier phase when we faced it. And there are 5 reasons for that. Number 1, the political environment is somewhat turbulent as compared to then. So that affects your national will and capacity to develop a consensus, which is the fundamental requirement to bring everybody on board for a decisive and effective strategy against terrorism, number 1. Second is the economic aspect, which is also very important because in the earlier phase, you were the frontline ally of the US and you were getting not as per your expectation, but significant financial support in terms of coalition support funds, which is not the case right now. The third aspect is diplomatic. And in the neighboring country, you have Afghan Taliban government, which has an ideological affinity and sympathy despite its role in trying to mediate in the unsuccessful diplomatic overtures that we've had so far with TTP. That's the third dimension. The fourth is that we are entering into a revival phase of terrorism after an unsuccessful negotiations and peace efforts. So that time allowed TTP to reinforce itself, to expand its influence and support base in those settled areas. So actually, as you earlier pointed out, we should have a proactive approach. I think it is perhaps late for that.
Yeah.
However, now we need immediately 3 things. First, I think it is imminent. Pakistan Army has new leadership now, so they have an incentive after General Asim Munir gets all the briefings to advise the political leadership, the Prime Minister, to hold a National Security Committee meeting that allows all the stakeholders to look afresh at the situation, the threat, the nature, and come up with a national strategy, an improved version of whatever, and also based on the mistakes and the gaps of the earlier National Action Plan, and then build consensus and then move forward accordingly.
All right. Farooq, considering the situation as of now, there is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of talk with regards to the recent attack in the federal capital. And I understand why that is important. But of course, it's also important to recognize the issues or the attacks that have been widespread and coming up more often in parts, the other parts of the country, such as KP. And we've also seen in terms of our responses that even previously, the kind of plans that we have had perhaps lack the kind of consensus or coordination that Mr. Ari was also referring to. And then when we look at where we stand today and the kind of threat that exists, isn't it important also to be able to take in the account or input of the stakeholders from other parts of the country as well, who've been at the forefront of these attacks or have been suffering for much longer, in terms of consolidating the kind of approach that we would have to fight this problem?
Right, Sana, I think that this is a very important question. It kind of reminds me, because Ali Saab actually came up with these 4 points that I heard. I have a little bit of reservation, so to speak, regarding these points, because I think that political situation was never that even in this country, right? Let me remind everybody who's watching that just before APS attack, which actually changed the direction of the country's response to terrorism. Before that, Imran Khan Sahib was sitting in Islamabad for months and months and protesting. Similarly, during People's Party's time as well, we saw one crisis after another, then another, and that continued. So political crisis is not the issue.
Okay.
Regarding economic aspect, I understand that receiving coalition support was a very important thing. It is not there, but still our capacity is there. We have seen the result, the kind of result that was needed. And one example that I'm going to give you of these two attacks, particularly Banu and Islamabad, at both places, the matter was contained before it went out of the very premises, right? In Islamabad, a terrorist tried to, bring in the explosives. We stopped him there, and he was actually somehow he detonated himself, killing a police official. But having said that, let me point out that whatever it is, our security, our ability to, push back is there, and it is quite visible. Similarly, this, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, anti-terrorism center, which was actually overtaken by inmates, that too was contained within its, four walls, and it could not expand beyond that. So all these things are important to remember because the state has the muscle and it has the muscle memory to go on. Now, regarding this fact that we actually decided to, after negotiations, we are actually doing it. I agree on diplomatic front regarding Afghanistan because the Afghan government at this moment is beyond reason. And this is one thing that is beyond anybody's control right now. I don't think how do you actually contain that. But the last bit, negotiations, remember that they have been negotiations all along, and every time you had to conduct an operation. Remember Shakai, remember Sararoga, remember Sawat, remember the fact that even before Zadbiar Azab started, there was a huge negotiation where TTP actually nominated Imran Khan Sahab to negotiate from their side, not our side, right? So all these things were there. We do lack, cohesion whenever we negotiate, but then we come together. Yesterday's picture where Army Chief and Chairman Joint Chief of Staff Committee are shouldering the body, the coffin of Lieutenant Fahad Khan, who was martyred in Balochistan, is indication enough that our resolve is there. When it comes to seeking, consensus, all political parties can be sought, but I think that national action plan that we reached before is good enough to take action on.
All right, and we'll talk more about that. Mr. Kaleem Imam, considering, of course, that the attacks that we were earlier mentioning, we, of course, owe it to the police to, of course, save us from such a damage that could have happened. And then, of course, our security personnel, our armed forces, who in the past also have given numerous sacrifices in the face of this threat. And even now, we've seen that there is an increased activity in terms of the kind of security deployments that exist both in the federal capital and elsewhere. But I'd like to ask you, in terms of where we stand today and where our police stands today, are we equipped, are our policemen equipped with the kind of resources that they need to be able to fight this menace, and especially in terms of the kind of implementation that needs to exist with regards to the plan on ground? What exactly do you think is a requirement there from the institution as well to be able to support these policemen in this task?
And Dr. Saab, this question is bigger now because the policeman who was actually who stopped the terrorist did not, I believe, have the kind of bomb disposal equipment that was needed. How easy it is or how difficult it is to actually provide the frontline cops with all this equipment, sir?
Thank you, Sana. Well, first of all, it all started after 2001, 9/11, and it took us decades to understand how really to fight this serpent of terrorism. And after the formation of CTD, a lot of logistics have been provided, a lot of trainings, new recruits, specialized training, all those things have happened. And as a result of which, you can see that the incidents have gone down, the acts have, the suicide commissions have gone down. But coming to the question of Mr. Pratapi, yes, the man posted at Sabzi Mandi, Adil, uh, was there, and I was told that they had some specific information also. But there is really nothing you can do about this suicide bomber or the man who come to the explosive, and when he's at your front gate. You have to stop it through good intelligence. You have to understand where the sleeper cells are, who the handlers are, where is he getting the IEDs from, what has been used, who has been planning. It all has to start with good intelligence. And for that, I think IB, a special branch, can play a very important role. They have been even CTD have their own intelligence setup with the help of the ISI and MI. They all work together in that way. But the only way to stop them is the intelligence. The only way is to stop them through intelligence. Yes, you can do some preventive. You can take some preventive measures like NACA, patrolling, combing the area. But actually, it's going to be preemptive action, like finding out who these actually persons are, and then going after them to stop, namely stopping them to actually come to the cities. But there's, fighting terrorists is not an easy job. This is a different sort of when he comes, he's not going back. He's just come there to finish the target or to bring as much as collateral damage as we can. Sana pointed out, one of the important factors is that this is a premier law enforcement agency, and I keep repeating, their capacity, their share, their understanding should be there in fight against terrorism. For example, they are not even part of National Security Commission, the committee which is formed. The Ministry of Interior actually is representing the police leadership over there. It's time that the four large provinces and five including Islamabad, their leadership should be part of National Security Committee so that they can have a first information on what they have to say and what sort of information is collected. They can collate, analyze, and then probably take a collective actions to go after this people. And then my last point would be that we already have policies. Are we implementing them? As an IG, I've seen that we have stopped implementing them for many years now. We don't have apex committee meetings. We just do knee jerk. We are taking knee jerks reactions, and we are not actually responding to what is happening on the ground. You see, we needed to take a lot of non-kinetic measures, the development program, the health program, the education programs, mainstreaming, the registration of madrasas. We all know that most of them are linked to one madrasa or the other. We cannot deny that fact. So how can we regulate them? How can we mainstream them? How can we actually stop them? The root cause, which was also mentioned by one of the panelists over here, we need to address the root cause of what is actually happening. Only then we can move forward.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that, but I want to also understand, Mr. Ali, considering, of course, that these are not causes or factors that we are just finding out about. We have, of course, been aware of them for quite some time. And as we were discussing earlier, perhaps the last attack in the capital was back 8 years ago. And we have, of course, been successful in a lot of ways, but have we also contributed towards the development with regards to uprooting these issues and factors that contribute towards the issue of terrorism itself as well, especially in terms of mainstreaming with the provinces, with different communities, and making sure that we don't have the kind of alliances that perhaps we have reports coming in that seem to be stemming, or also in terms of protecting the citizens or addressing their valid concerns. Has there any work been done in the past 8 years at least towards that?
I think some work has gone in that direction, definitely. But to summarize and give a brief answer to your profound question is, it's not the lack of policies like Dr. Kaleem Imam rightly pointed out, but it's the lack of comprehensive approach and lack of consistent approach, without which a social phenomena cannot be completely eradicated. And let me revisit my first argument in my earlier intervention. I think political prong is the most important prong. When Dr. Kaleem says that there are policies but they are not being implemented, so why are they not being implemented? Is it because of the lack of political will? If the document is there, so what's stopping them from implementing it? Number one. Or perhaps those decisions or policies are politically costly for those people who represent the people in those constituencies. So those things need to understand and have an unemotional, dispassionate and realistic appraisal that, well, you can have an ideal policy, but is it practical? Is it doable? So when you expect governance, when you expect de-radicalization, when you expect to mainstream and incentivize responsible good behavior from people who have a bad history, then I think they need consistent approach. You cannot have, just because the kinetic reaction becomes the only option, only then you act. This is actually a failure of strategy. When you talk about strategy, the most important non-kinetic strategic prongs are political and psychological.
Okay.
Whether the psychological space for that mindset, that ideology has been reduced in those areas or not. That is because it is the psychological space within which such non-state actors justify, legitimize and gain influence, within which they play and exercise their irresponsible terrorist behavior. So the fundamental core in elimination of any terrorist movement is to deny them, to deprive them, to eliminate their psychosocial space. If that does not need to be done by police and army, that has to be done by the political leadership. They have to incentivize good behavior and they have to isolate and disincentivize bad behavior. Without that, occasionally, physically clearing the ground, physically eliminating the individuals, and then going into your barracks and bases for the next few years and waiting them to come back again, and the kinetic seems to be the only prong, and that is, I think, a failure of governance and a failure of the psychosocial prong. The madrasas reforms, the Wafaqul Madaris, all these institutions are critical unless they are convinced that the monopoly over violence has to be with the state and no non-state actor will be allowed without any discrimination to have any weapons or right of use of force anywhere else. This cannot be done only by army or law enforcement agencies.
Okay, but Farooq, I want to understand something. Considering these factors, I understand how these factors play into this whole dynamic, but I want to also understand if these are the only factors from which this issue of terrorism is springing out from, or are there any other external factors also which we'll need to deal with, and perhaps which we need a different approach or different strategy as well?
Right. And I think, again, an excellent question. But allow me to actually add to what Aliza was saying earlier, and Dr. Imam as well. Now, regarding political aspect, I'm no apologist for politicians. I think that politicians have been failing on this matter quite consistently. And not one party, I think every party. But my humble submission is that when you're talking about, National Action Plan, of course, there were two sides to it. One military side, the other civilian. Let us call it civilian rather than political, because that is important. In that, we have seen a lot of foot dragging, no doubt about that. War on terror started in 2001. Until 2014-15, we did not or could not get one fatwa from our Maulanas who would have said that because suicide is haram in Islam, suicide bombing cannot be halal either, right? It is a simple math, very easy to consult Quran and then actually go and state this. But they could not do it. Finally, because our war on terror strategy has been driven essentially, we have to admit that, by the military side. Even the non-kinetic part is also driven by them. General Rahil Sharif, took initiative. Asif Ali Zardari played a very crucial role in putting together national consensus behind National Action Plan. But having said that, it is driven by the military side. In that context, Sana, it is very important to remember that in the civilian side, there is fear of consequences. Because when you talk about the military side, there's always our impression is that there is fortified places where if you attack, you are going to face consequences. But for a civilian who is sitting out of in the middle of nowhere, it becomes a serious, serious challenge. And for that, I have to actually ask one question. I have to ask myself, why is it that we actually abandoned military courts? Because that was the easiest way to actually get rid of jet black terrorists and totally actually contain the matter. On one side, we stopped that from happening. On the other side, again, this root cause and this, ideational or ideological issues, these might be there, but this time, do you know how did the actual problem start? When Taliban took over Afghanistan, they actually said to us that, look, TTP might be your enemy or you are pursuing them, they are our brothers, they have fought with us, so we are going to negotiate. But there are families attached to these people who need to come back because they are also displaced. And for that, what did we do, Sana? We allowed them back and we removed all the pickets from the former tribal areas. If you give the other side so much power, they are going to walk all over you. And this is what has been happening in Kabul. Even now, there are advertisements seeking suicide bombers to attack Pakistan. When you have this kind of a situation, of course, it is an external matter and you have to take care of this issue. But how will this happen? If you are going to once again go on a wild goose chase for the sake of what you call political consensus, it is not going to be there. There are 13 parties, in the ruling coalition. Ask them to sit together and come up with some kind of statement that is good enough. But then, of course, the army will have to take lead, and kinetic will have to be the first thing, followed by intelligence-based operations. Without that, you cannot contain this evil now because it is spreading and there is an engine attached to it that is sitting in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Mr. Kaleem Imam, considering, of course, what the issues that Farooq has pointed out, I'd like you to, of course, comment on that as well and the issue of military courts. But add to that also the problem when we talk about how we've come up with a national action plan. That was, of course, something that was birthed out of political consensus then. But even then, we haven't seen any sort of consistency in terms of how this has been approached. But if we are going to take a look at it from a military perspective and then try and understand the kind of measures that have been taken in the recent past, especially in areas that have been a victim for quite some time, how exactly do we also enhance our coordination with different units, especially in terms of where we stand in the federal capital and then in other areas of the country and our departments that are working with regards to counterterrorism in all the provinces, so that we have a more coordinated approach. There also seems to be, of course, perhaps simultaneously different activities going on without much data sharing or intelligence sharing, as you were earlier also emphasizing.
I would very respectfully disagree to some of the argument, and I think disagreement is part of discussion. You see,
Sure.
first of all, there is no room for military courts. You have to follow a due process. And I keep on saying that state has to be ruthlessly ethical. That's my first argument. The secondly, it has to have a civilian head. You see, our armed forces are very sacred, and they have a deterrence. They only come when the civil administration actually fails. My argument is that we need to ensure that civilian organizations and civilian agencies competency is built. They have the operational autonomy, tenure of security, logistics, technology, equipment, whatever you say. They are going to be your premier fighting first respondent on the ground. The armed forces, the civil armed forces, which is 17 in Pakistan, and of course the armed force, army, which is always there, they need to come and support the first line of action, which is actually engage who should be engaged in negotiation, who should be engaged in combating, who should be engaged in doing all sort of dialogues, kinetic, non-kinetic, whatever, they should be taken lead. And under the umbrella of the armed forces and civil armed forces, who should come as a second and third tier. That is my principal argument. And that is what I said, that in National Security Committee, you don't have a police leadership over there. I don't know who is representing them. Are we listening to what IG KPK and IG Punjab and IG Sin has to say, or
Interior
they are
Minister.
being
Interior Minister.
represented through Chief Secretary or the Home Secretary, or who is representing them? This has always been my argument. I believe they can do a good job, and I believe that they can do it. As far as National Action Plan is concerned, National Internal Security Policy is concerned, I will say again, we have policies, but we don't have the will, dedication, and diligence. The recent political chaos, the house disorder, the economical woes, all adding to a misery of what is actually happening. So now I would also like to talk about the second part, which is this
Okay.
recent tweets by some of the foreign embassies over here regarding Islamabad. Let me make it very clear that embassies do issue security alerts, and this is just a one-time security alert. It is done on some specific information that they have. I would suggest that Islamabad police and law enforcement agencies, the Foreign Office, should get in touch with them, hold regular meetings, take them into confidence, tell them what they have been doing, what they have been their response mechanism. That will
Right.
actually help in building that trust. If they have any feelings that this situation is not that good, it's not that bad. One of the police officer gave his ultimate sacrifice to secure all the foreigners, to secure all the cities. And like one of my panelists was saying again, this man is not equipped. And the second thing is, it's so difficult to stop a suicide bomber. The fact is, you have to do good intelligence to stop them. Let the civilian take the lead. Put them on the ground. They have the capacity and capability to do it. Armed forces have already done a great job. They must almost come in their support. Because wherever I go and I talk to civil administration and the police officers, most of the time they say we don't know what's happening. To be very fair, when they this statement, it pinches me actually. I, being IG myself, would like to be in a proactive role, and I think they should be taking the lead.
All right. Mr. Ali, considering, of course, that in the past, one of our move forwards with regards to the TTP was also dialogue. And we have seen that at numerous occasions and attempts at dialogue, we haven't really reached any sort of point where we can say that some progress has been made. And now, of course, we are where we stand today. Do you think that perhaps now it may be a time to abandon this approach altogether? And is that even a possibility considering where we stand today and how we want to move ahead? Why is it that we keep coming back to the issue of dialogue when it hasn't really given us any positive results?
There are two ways to look at the issue of dialogue. One is as part of a strategy in which you want to call their bluff and exhaust all options and actually have the higher moral ground that when you move in with the kinetic as the only option, after having proven before the antagonist as well as the nation that they're not living up to their commitment, then that is useful. But it is not. It shouldn't be either or, because when you study the history of insurgencies and terrorist movements over 100 years, you will realize that whenever a state overtly, publicly engages a non-state actor in a dialogue, it only legitimizes them. It uses that time and space to gain currency, to gain popularity, to gain space and support base. Within that ambit, it builds its room and space for violence and becomes more difficult and demanding. Secondly, objectively speaking, when you look at the specific demands that they've been raising, actually there is nothing that the state can actually concede, and it is always harmful for the national security interest. You want to undo the FATA reforms. You want to allow them to question your sovereignty and territorial integrity. You want them to allow them to expand their sphere of influence through some sort of courts or their own quasi political setups, or space for ideological entrenchment which challenges the sovereignty of the state. I mean, no matter what their demand is, specifically it incrementally reduces the sovereignty of the state, and surrendering and compromising on that will never allow this state to reduce their influence, to reduce their space, and to reduce their ability to use violence against the state and also against the citizens. So basically, if just to conclude my point, that if you use this as part of a strategy to isolate them, to gain a higher moral ground, to reduce their psychological space, and within them create factions, dividing the hardcore elements from those who've been doing it out of compulsion or incentive, and only when you have isolated the hardcore and then you move in for the kill, then that is perhaps that can be considered, but not either or.
All right, thank you for this segment and these views. Yes, very quickly.
Very quickly, I just wanted to say that, okay, we have tried, dialogue every time, and every time they have regrouped and come back. The humble submission, because Kaleem Imam Sahab actually disagreed with my points, is that we can keep on going on about, civil military, which should actually go first. My concern is that if you are talking about reforming a system that has been pending for 100 years, remember your CRPC, PPC actually belonged to the British era. If you think that your courts are suddenly going to transform into this well-oiled machine that is going to give all the kind of solutions, that won't happen. We have to realize that terrorism was, is, and will be an existential challenge, and because it is there, you please remember that you cannot just say that one side which hasn't been able to perform for ages suddenly comes to life and starts doing everything. Fight first, solve later. If you want to hold dialogue, beat the enemy to the pulp, and then whatever remains, whoever surrenders, then talk to them.
All right, that's all we have time for this segment, but thank you very much, Mr. Kaleem Imam, for joining us and being a part of the discussion. Mr. Ali would like you to stay for the next one as well. We'll take a short break and continue with our next segment.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Perspective. That has its own impact on our economy. It has its own impact on, as far as the economic stability is concerned. And there doesn't seem to be any regard for that at all.
Of course. And he is not only talking about the, country is going to default, but he is predicting and he's professing in a very, sort of harsh manners all the time.
We want to have good bilateral relation with America. Then he comes with the early elections. Now he says, no problem whenever the elections are held.
Sadiqul Farooq Sahab, do you feel that you have the numbers?
We can make it a success. We can go for a coalition government. And there are so many options. I can't
With who?
Right
coalition
now.
Government with who?
With PMLQ.
He has no economic plan, that's a given, because that's what we see, how the economy spiraled from a 6% growth to a -1% growth even before COVID.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Perspective.
Welcome back to the debate. We're now going to be talking about what is going on in Gawader for quite some time. The Haq Do Tehreek, which is being led by the leader Maulana Hidayatur Rahman, who has previously also led such protest movements in the area, has been going on for quite some time, and they have, of course, numerous demands, including illegal trawling, issue with maritime boundaries, recovery of missing persons, and concessions with regards to border with Iran and other related issues. We've also, of course, heard reports coming in that that they haven't said anything with regards to their demands being as part of issues with the CPEC, but of course there may be perhaps deeper issues with regards to that. But then of course when we take a look at the situation, there is also a concern of political interests and political gains being also part of this, since it seems that this kind of support that this particular movement had in the past hasn't been there. But what is of course important here is that the government of course has been trying to diffuse tensions and carry out negotiations, but the response that they've been meted out with is not something which the government was expecting, especially in terms of how so many of the demands have already been met. Farooq, when we take a look at this particular situation, and especially the fact that this has been going on for quite some time, and also that there are concerns of political interests and gains over here at the moment, there seems to be of course a kind of distinction that needs to be drawn with protests which are valid and which of course need to be addressed, but also with the kind of issues that are then being politicized and then are being used to stall the country or stall any sort of democratic process to continue, especially with regards to trade and the transport of goods as well, which was stalled for quite some time. Where exactly do you think the situation in Gawader stands at the moment? And if there is not much of a response coming in from the leaders of this particular movement, what should the next step of the current political setup be?
Right, Sana, bad business indeed. A police constable was killed in the clashes between the protesters and the authorities. That is very sad. But regarding the demands and regarding what has been going on, you have to understand the long-term and the short-term issues. In the long term, of course, Gawader was really neglected. We kept on, buying property around Gawader and kept on saying that Gawader is going to touch the sky. But simultaneously, the actual population of Gawader sitting in the middle, because it is from three sides, it's ocean, right? In the middle, in the core of the city, they did not have water. They did not have electricity. They did not have sewerage, anything else of that sort. And then political management, because Balochistan's capital, Quetta, is so far off from Gawader, that also created a lot of problem. So their initial demands, because Maulana Hidayatur Rahman is actually head of Gawader Ko Haq Do Tehreek, which did really well in the local government elections, right? The initial demands were very legitimate and they were realistically very real regarding water, electricity, supplies, education, all those things. I think they have been met. Wherever they were not met, the promise is there and the government of Pakistan is building up to actually offer that solution. But now this, because political movements have the momentum of their own, and then I'm sure that there are people who are egging him on as well to seek rent and to actually block development projects. So they have actually returned. They have been doing it for many weeks actually. They come and go, but this time they have actually had blocked the coastal highway. Recently I was in Gawader, so I can tell you that a lot needs to be done, but the people who are there are actually really trying to deliver. So I think that at this moment it is unfair to keep protesting and then kill constable or attack authorities. But on the other side, the demands, at least the initial demands, were very legitimate. And I think that if something needs to be fulfilled, although they were agreed upon, if they need to be fulfilled, we can actually fasten up the pace.
Right, absolutely. Mr. Ali, considering of course that the kind of security issues that we've been talking about in the show also exist in Balochistan, and this is of course important, and especially of course the demand of deployments by the armed personnel is also something that exists and cannot of course be addressed. This is of course giving more rise to concerns as to how long this is going to be carried out, especially if it is closely linked with political gains as well. And then of course there is the issue of its impact on the CPEC. So far it seems that they're distancing themselves away from it, but of course it's bound to have some sort of consequence on how it is going to go ahead. What do you see in terms of the way that especially CPEC is going to be impacted, and then of course the larger security concerns of the province?
I think let's try to simplify it in four dimensions. First, is the cultural one. I think the administration, the political leadership, the security, and the foreign investors need to be culturally sensitive. The Baloch people are very proud people, self-respecting people. So it's very important that however you deal with them, you know, are respectful and are culturally sensitive. Number one. The second is like Pathavi Saab pointed out, and I agree with him, that you know, the administrative issues need to be distinguished from the political concerns. Those issues which escalate as a consequence of bad governance or bad administration, they then translate into political demands or concerns. So it is very important that in order to enjoy the political legitimacy, the political government of Balochistan needs to ensure that the administration does its job properly, is accountable, is fair, transparent, and if there are some issues with the administration, that they need to be taken to task in order to enjoy the support and the trust of the people. The third is the political domain, in which if there are some political issues, then I think these concerns should be dealt with in the Balochistan Assembly. Have these issues, concerns being raised there, and if not, debated and addressed, because that will also pacify that. Beyond that, I think when you come to the security, I think that should be the last resort, and that again as a political scientist tantamounts to the failure of administration, governance, political, only then it translates into a security, and that should always be the last resort, and that this how I think these issues should be prioritized. First, the culturally sensitive, second, administrative effectiveness, third, political management, and only as a last resort, the security.
Right.
Yes,
I totally agree with this, conclusion. But I wanted to just point out that most of the concerns that they have been highlighting at this moment, Gawadar's basic economics is focused with maritime fishing, actually, right? And they keep on complaining that trawlers are allowed from outside, and they actually fish, and then they leave dead fish, and then they go away. So those concerns have been partly addressed already. But regarding culture, my concern at this moment is that I think that all authorities are really cognizant of the sensitivities, and they have been going out of the way to accommodate the people. Pakistan Navy is running schools and health centers. Pakistan Army is running schools and health centers. Foreigners who are there have actually, particularly Chinese company, have actually offered jobs for women there as well, with parda and every provision that was needed. At this moment, I think the biggest problem, Sana, I spent a week there recently. My concern was that we met all the leadership, civil, military. The only animal that we could not find in the jungle was politics.
Right, of course, and I understand your point, and we hope that that changes soon. Thank you very much, Mr. Ali, for joining us. Thank you, Farooq. That's all that we have from the debate. See you tomorrow.